Wonderful, thank you very much. Okay, so my interest is in sex-gender differences in neuroimaging, and I'm coming from the perspective of feminist philosophy of science. So the questions that I'm interested in, are there sex-gender differences in the brain, in brain structure or in brain function? Also, are there problematic practices employed in the research? And if so, if there are problematic practices, how can feminist philosophy of science improve research in this domain? So next I need to define what sex essentialism is. Sex essentialism is a type of biological essentialism. It's the view that men and women are essentially different due to their sex or biology. And this is the view that there's a male brain, there's a female brain. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And this will be important for what I'm going to try to do today in my very short time. I won't be able to fully argue for these, but just to show you where I'm headed. First, I want to talk about sex essentialism affecting research in many ways and limiting research in this domain, and limiting the results and what we can say. I also want to talk about how feminist philosophy of science offers solutions to the limitations of the research that I found. So, first, the example of sex essentialism. Menstruation is a cognitive task, visual spatial cognitive task, in which men are often thought to outperform women. In the scanner, you would see two objects similar to these. Sometimes other types of drawings would be used. And the participant would be asked to mentally rotate one of the images to see if the two images are the same or different. When they do get activation differences between men and women in the scanner, they might explain these activation differences as men and women are invoking different cognitive strategies. They're using different cognitive strategies to solve these mental rotation problems. The problem with this is they're just reading the cognitive strategy off the activation data. What does that mean? Well, first we have to talk about how they analyze the data. They do a subtraction analysis. So they sum all the group data for men. They make an average group map of all the areas of the brain that are active in men, and they subtract from that the average group map of the data for women. And then any leftover activation are the areas that are significantly more active in men, but not in women. And then they do the same for the other way around to show the areas of the brain that are significantly more activated in women, but not men. So when you're looking at this data, knowing that these are the areas of the brain that are significantly more active in women versus men, you look at this area of the brain and see that it's active, and you may be using a gender stereotype to interpret what that part of the brain is doing. So knowing that you're looking at the activation for women, or knowing that you're looking at the activation for men, lets you interpret the data with this gender stereotype in mind. So the different type of cognitive strategies that they used, here's a few of the suggestions. Men are using a gestalt strategy, whereas women are using a serial strategy and rotated the figure in parts. Men are using an effortless bottom-up or natural strategy, whereas women are using an effortful top-down strategy. Now, note, in the scanner, they're not actually getting women to perform worse than men. There's actually no performance differences in the scanner in these studies. In their small groups of usually 6 to 12 participants per group, they're not actually getting performance differences. But yet, they're explaining the data as if women are doing worse than men. So you can see, first of all, that you think that there's different strategies. There's a male way of doing it and a female way of doing it, or representing the sex essentialism that's affecting the research, as well as the value-laden language that they're using. So like I said, they're just reading the cognitive strategy off of the activation data. They're just inferring what part of the brain is doing what based on this gender stereotype. But it's an actual hypothesis. It's actually testable that they're doing, but they're not actually testing it. So they're not actually testing to see if women are doing what they say they're doing. They're just stating that this is what women are doing. So my first point is that invoking cognitive strategies is a way for sexist stereotypes to enter into science and gain scientific legitimacy, an example of sex essentialism. The second example of sex essentialism is the assumption that social and environmental factors don't affect mental rotation ability. So when they take a group of men and women, they don't ask them anything about their previous backgrounds. They just put a group of men and women in the scanner and scan them, and any differences they find, they think is due to sex. The few studies that actually consider the social science literature mentioned that there's this other body of research that they study this, but didn't actually take that into account and say we think that sexism is the more important factor than this other social science literature. But the thing is, social influences matter. There's way too much for me to talk about in my short time, but I just want to point out a few of them. So The types of sports and hobbies and how often you play those sports and hobbies can affect your visual spatial ability, including mental rotation. Playing video games is correlated with improvements in mental rotation ability. And you can actually be trained on video games, and training on these video games can eliminate the sex-gender difference. Mental rotation ability correlates with the number of science and math courses you've taken. And then it can be improved with practice. So perhaps maybe we need to start thinking about mental rotation not as a fixed ability, but as something that is a skill that can be developed. And then also confidence level is a better predictor of performance on mental rotation than gender. And you can also manipulate the sex-gender differences by manipulating stereotype threat, as well as altering the instructions. By taking out the word spatial, you can eliminate the sex-gender difference. So there are many ways that social environmental factors can manipulate the sex-gender difference. So the next point is that neuroimaging researchers aren't considering the social science literature that shows that the effect of social experience on mental rotation ability or performance. They just take these people out of context, out of their lived lives and gendered lives, and the many ways that the sex or gender difference can be manipulated through contextual factors. Again, this shows that by just taking this group of people in the world, the only thing that they think that differs between a group of men and women is sex. So let's go to feminist philosophy of science all too quickly. So feminist philosophy of science applies frameworks to identify sexist and androcentric science, to develop alternate practices in science to address epistemological and social goals. Epistemological goals, better science; social goals, science that doesn't harm women and other oppressed groups. So far, you have the philosophers over here doing their philosophy in their armchairs, and then you have the scientists over here doing science in their labs, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of communication between those two groups. So that's part of what my project is to help these groups start to communicate. So my project is to tailor a feminist philosophy of science to the specifics of a discipline of science, cognitive neuroscience, to make it more relevant and useful to practitioners of science. So to make this theory, turn it into language and specific tasks and processes and practices that the scientists use so they can see how it's relevant to their work. The specific feminist philosophy of science I work with is called feminist standpoint empiricism, and very briefly, it takes seriously that there are power structures in society and the implications for knowledge production where you are within these power structures. And it suggests initiating inquiry from the perspective of the oppressed. That's a language that we use in philosophy, but if you don't like that language, other terms you could think of are unrepresented or underrepresented. Perhaps those who are in positions of less power, those who are in positions of less authority. So if you start knowledge from these positions of oppression, their view of the world is different. It's less partial and less distorted from those people that are in positions of power. So they're able to see gaps within the traditional knowledge structures that those that are in positions of power just are blind to. They're just ignorant of, they're just ignoring or don't think about. So those that are in the positions of oppression are able to see gaps within traditional our knowledge structures. And then it has a social aim, which is including the perspective of the oppressed and including them in the research, involving them in the research, serves to lessen the likelihood of oppressive knowledge. So for the question of sex-gender differences, given a patriarchal society, that means starting inquiry from women's lives. Other questions, there might be more oppressed positions to start research from. So in developing a feminist philosophy of cognitive neuroscience, I'm combining feminist standpoint empiricism with the specifics of practicing cognitive neuroscience. So instead of a framework based on sex essentialism, I suggest using a framework from this feminist standpoint. This involves initiating inquiry from the perspective of women's lives, reflecting on the differences between women's lives and men's lives, and incorporating the interests of women in the research. When we do this, by tying the theory to the specifics of practice, we get specific recommendations for changes along the research pathway, from the research question to the experimental setup, data collection and analysis, and to the interpretation and dissemination of results. In the interest of time, I'm only going to mention some of the things that have to do with changing the research question or rethinking the research question. So in rethinking the research question, one thing that we can do is overhaul the existing question or research program, the sex differences research, from the feminist standpoint. Another option we can do is to start from the feminist standpoint and ask entirely different questions. So I'm going to briefly talk about these. So how do we do sex-gender difference research that doesn't harm women? Well, incorporate a theory of sex and gender, reject the assumption of sex essentialism, start thinking about the effect of social environmental experience, and contextualizing results so that women aren't further oppressed. If we go with the second option and break the sex dichotomy, this opens up a whole new areas of investigation that currently aren't being investigated. So the focus on sex-gender differences is limiting us from doing anything else, from understanding more about what's going on behind those sex-gender differences. So once we break the sex dichotomy, we can then investigate with the role of experience, we can investigate what's going on in stereotype threat, we can attempt to connect these cognitive strategies to actual patterns of brain activation, and understand better what's going on in brain development for gender messaging, confidence, etc. So that's just my suggestions for changing the research question. Again, I have suggestions for the other things we can get to if you'd like in the Q&A in the end. So I just want to thank you very much for your attention.